they've come back to us and said, things are really bad. But we need those stories, those personal stories, because even our pitches need to reflect them so that, the editors are like, that's a story. They totally understand that we need to cover the story about hunger, and they support that. But when I pitch my story, they want to know, so what's different? What are you going to do? How are you going to do it differently?
Yeah.
And it is stories like the ones that he has told that sell, even for the audience. Because when you talk about the hyenas and, people will stop what they're watching on TikTok, the entertainment, and they're like, wait a minute. And they can relate because it is about children. It's about survival. So the challenge for us is to get those very personal stories and to bring them. How to get them is where the challenge lies. And, how long do you take to get there? You talked about Libya. How many media houses have been able to deploy to Libya? In terms of access, security, and even just because of the disaster that has happened, that is a challenge for many people. But when you talk about entertainment, it's constantly there. You literally just need to sit in your home and do a story that will travel, that, young people will, even older people will connect with. So it's really about access. The stories are there. So the challenge is on us as journalists to find those personal stories. And, there's this talk about the shock effect. Isn't there the shock effect in those stories, in those personal stories? Yes, we can find them. We can go the extra step, the extra mile of finding those stories, talking to people on the ground and bringing them to life. And I can give many examples, but I'll let my colleagues also have a chance. It's totally doable. And there's a lot of interest. In the newsrooms, there is a lot of interest in these stories. And then when you also broaden it out to why this is happening, why have we had 5 consecutive seasons of failed rains? And when you talk to the experts and, they're beginning to talk about climate change, and there is a lot of interest. So we just need to break down this information and also just bring it back to where it really matters. It's about people.
Does it matter the source of these stories or this information? Because, say, for example, this humanitarian worker like Unni has traveled there and he's seen the story. By the time we pitch it back to you, does it matter that it's an NGO that's pitched it? And also the whole process of now you saying you have to pitch it, get funding, travel. Have you explored ways, especially now with what we'd call citizen journalism, or just having people who are on the ground, whether they're humanitarian workers or even locals themselves, who can record those stories in their own eyes as citizen journalists, or however they'd want to craft their title, and then send them to you? Is that something that is an option for media houses? Because I know sometimes the process of you getting to the field takes longer and the story, could move quickly. Is that an option, or?
Well, it will depend on the media house and their editorial policies. In terms of getting the story together, I'm not sure many mainstream media houses will rely on, especially an organization, to do the journalism for them. They'll be hesitant to do that. But they could interview them as experts about what you have seen on the ground. You can talk about that as a contributor, as an expert on programs. But there are creative ways that we have used also in the past to get access where it's very difficult. We're talking about Sudan at the moment. It's very difficult for any foreign journalist to get in. But there are important stories that need to come out of there, including about food. The Ebola outbreak you and I were talking about earlier in West Africa, when, airlines had stopped going there and it was very difficult to get in. We started some radio diaries. So we were asking the health workers who are working there, can you record a diary about how your day went? And, you know, when you go back to your accommodation, just take a few minutes and just take us through what you saw and, you know, how you felt about it. And so that way the story still, the story is still told. But the best way we still want to do our journalism is to actually be present ourselves on the ground. And yes, we will talk to NGOs, we will talk to organizations, to, you know, experts who work on the ground. But at the end of the day, people connect with personal stories. So they will watch you as the expert on air, and they'd be like, ah, okay. But when they actually see this grandmother talking about her story, and we have filmed her boiling this water and then discarding it, it just, the impact is just different completely. It just stays with you, that story. And that's where we come in. That's the journalism that needs to go into this. So it's a mix of everything. We just try to keep the story going.
Yeah. Thank you. Gathara, maybe I'll come to you following up on the shock factor. I know now, when it leads used to be what we'd use to sort of say what is a story that's breaking the news or breaking the headlines. But now there are a lot of values, a lot of guidelines that are against us, you know, exposing some pictures that may have what we refer to as a shock value. Maybe from your experience, what now qualifies as the shock factor, and how, especially in your position, are you incorporating new perspectives when it comes to talking about the food crisis?
I think we have to query the whole framework of shocking people into watching the news. I think, just to follow on what Anne was saying, we also have to ask who tells the news. You know, a lot of, and it's told for whose benefit, to whom are we, who's the audience. Now, the typical way crises were covered in the past would be Western journalist goes to some place in Africa, in the global south, a term I don't like, but and report about the suffering there to a Western audience. You know, that's how it was always framed. And the portrayals of people, and the reason why there are so many ethical problems, was the portrayal was very much about how people are victims, incapable of response. They're just waiting for help, for aid. They're waiting to be saved, you know. But this is not how crises actually work. You know, if you look at there's a report that was done by ODI in 2019 that says that for people, even in the most in the worst crisis, if you look at the resources they have, you know, that come to them, international aid, what the international humanitarian aid, is about 2% of that. Most of the people helping are their neighbors, neighboring countries. You know, it's people doing stuff for themselves. That never gets covered. You know, it's what you're saying about who are the real heroes in this thing. The second thing is who does the coverage. So Anne says she's in Nairobi, gets a story, she's got to fly there. Why can't those people tell their own stories? You know, why don't we have journalists there? Because, I mean, I've been to Somalia. There's plenty of journalists. If you call a press conference in Somalia, they all turn up with cameras, with equipment, etc. You know, so again, who's telling this story? We're waiting for the big international networks to turn up, you know, when they can actually have a network model where they get their news from on the ground, what you're saying about who's actually there, the people who live in there, and they would give you more nuanced coverage, you know. And I think one of the problems, again, comes to how we understand how crises manifest. So you'll think of Ethiopia, and you imagine everybody in Ethiopia is starving. You know, Ethiopia 1984, that's the image you get. You know, when you're told of a place like Goma, you imagine everybody is in crisis. You know, everybody's in an IDP camp. But that's not how it works. You know, there are people doing stuff that don't get seen. And that means that when there's a response, international response, it is not nuanced in that way. It's not seeing that actually we are coming in to supplement what's already happening. So I think it's really important that rather than look to let's create more shock for Western audiences, to start thinking how can we create a better understanding of how the crisis is manifesting, so that then the help that comes is better. And I completely accept that we need the eyeballs, we need the attention, And there are some stories that will come out that will do that. But if that's all we have, then we end up with solutions that don't really solve the issue. We end up with a sort of crisis that that become chronic. So actually nowadays, if you look at many humanitarian crises, they are becoming longer and longer. It's it's 5 years, it's 20 years. If you look at Somalia, you can argue Somalia has been in crisis for about 30, 40 years. So just seeing the hunger now, then blinds you to what else is happening. Yeah. So how do we keep that going? How do we keep the coverage of that going? I think one way of doing that is getting the Somalis to tell their own stories, and then finding ways of giving a platform for that to happen. I'll give an example of something we're doing at the New Humanitarian, which is called the Yemen Listening Project. So when you think of Yemen, what comes to mind? But is that the same way Yemenis see it? So what happens when we give them the tools? We give them the platform. You record your life in Yemen, what it looks like, and come and tell it. So if you actually go there are some really interesting stories, and the Yemenis who are saying, actually, we are not just defined by the crisis. Yes, there is a crisis, nobody refuses, but it's not the only thing that's there. And I think one of the ways to combat the sort of fatigue that we're having with the news, which is a big problem, is to show people that actually it's not a story of that place that is very it's almost it's almost unsolvable. They're always in crisis, but to show their humanity, to show them as human beings. And I also think one final thing is what happens when we talk of food crisis are not things that just happen in places like Somalia. What if we talk about the fact that in the UK you had record number of people going to food banks? Why don't we call it food aid, which is what it is? And if those people can start understanding that they face the same vulnerabilities as people in Somalia, they can start forging common cause, because lots of times the same drivers, are present, across the place. During COVID, you saw in the US, people lining up, for food aid. We didn't call it that. Nobody called it a humanitarian crisis, but that's exactly what it was. So by sort of bifurcating the world into places that work and places that are sort of shitholes, to use Donald Trump's term, we are telling people that you cannot see yourself in the crisis, the suffering of the other. I don't think we need shock factor to do that. I just think we need to tell better stories, and we need to actually give an opportunity for the people who are in crisis to actually tell their own stories.
I like that, Gathara, very much, because it's also something we found out, and especially when COVID happened, when people thought they could go anywhere at any time and do anything with communities, and then COVID happened and we all could not move, and then we realized that when there's an issue in a specific country, the community are the first people on the ground, and most times even the only people on the ground who respond. And I think COVID was a very good learning curve for all of us to know that people can tell their own stories because they can be their own heroes, they can create their own solutions on the ground. And I like that you've opened that pathway of they can tell their own stories because they are on the ground. So thank you so much for that. When we're speaking about wordings, Basma, I'll come to you. We are moving from the shock factor. We really want to tell the stories. But I know from the UN perspective, there's some nuances that we wouldn't want to use when we're talking about, say, the food crisis, shying off from words like hunger, famine, drought. Maybe talk to us about how these words are placed and how, from the UN perspective, you would want them to be aired or put in the media, so to speak.
Yes, thank you, Evelyn. So as you mentioned, the words like many words related to hunger are actually a bit technical, and they have like some information behind them on the level of need of food, etc. So we are aware of the differences, and we are aware that we need to report on accurate data. So we would always prefer not to exhaust these words and to be very accurate when reporting on them. And specifically the word famine might have political sensitivities, because declaration of famine in a certain country will also have like an impact on the state, especially if like there was no agreement on the declaration. So there are always we're not against, but there are always many considerations or not going for these words like without consideration, without further thought. But I also want to add something on food crisis. So I think food crisis is not only about food. There are many impacts of the food insecurity on the communities facing this problem. These impacts can be, of course, impact on like gender impacts. For example, women facing gender-based violence because of like lack of food, because the husband cannot afford the needed food. So many problems got generated, and and also education, the same thing. Children are out of school because they need to work to support, triggering displacement, health issues, you name it. So I think it's very important to look at the wider picture of how can we focus on not only hunger is very important, and we need to talk about it, but also we need to look at the consequences and the long-term impacts of hunger. And I also want to add something, adding to what my colleagues mentioned about stories. Actually, it's related in a way to food, but it's also about the wider picture. So I think I'm really with like focusing on human interest stories and having people relate and tell their own stories. And I think what I saw working is showing people as strong, dignified, and empowered. This is very important. I'll give some examples. So for example, on social media, on our platforms, we saw like a lot of tractions and engagements when we told the story of a female doctor in Sudan helping her own community. Because this is very important to different kinds of audiences. Including Sudanese diaspora, because it's very important to show not only like oppressed, victimized people who are in need, who are suffering, especially women and girls. And also the same for Somalia. I was in Somalia earlier this year, and I was impressed by a young woman supporting other young women in the displacement camps, providing awareness sessions about gender-based violence issues, etc. And also her story and the way she communicated with young girls and their families to educate them about the consequences of early marriage, etc., was very, very important and a very strong voice. Lastly, also lately in Sudan, as you mentioned, most of us have no access to Khartoum, for example, and we need to reach out to people to tell their stories, right? So actually, we got the opportunity of collaborating with local responders from emergency response rooms who were like supporting like in a very difficult circumstances, risking their lives. So we got to reach out and show and like working together with them to tell their own stories, because we could not tell it because we have no access actually. But actually it was a very important experience for me, because you know, it shows the real Sudanese people, like Somalia, like Somalian girls, etc. It's very important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, Anne.
Yes, I totally get what you're talking about, classification and using certain terms. And I know we were on your case, like during these 5 failed seasons of rain, like, are you declaring famine yet? Because, you know, such a declaration would mark an important, you know, it just takes the story to a different level. And why is it that we tell these stories? One, we want people to care, and that's why we need to get people who are actually affected by it, including the people who are trying to do something about it. We want to make people care. But also for us, because of the platforms that we have, it's to create changes to policy, whether that is about funding. It's very important to make that noise, yeah? And because of, you know, all the challenges we faced with misinformation, it's very important for us to actually authenticate what we are talking about, to do our due diligence. And, you know, Gathara, you did talk about the locals actually telling their stories. Absolutely. They're the authentic voice in all of this. But at the same time, I think we need to team up together to support each other. Because when you look at many of these crises, sometimes not just so much the drought, you look at Tigray, for example, the troubles we had in Tigray. We had local journalists who live there, but they are also affected by that crisis. And they were telling the story, but there are certain stories which, if they told, their lives would be in danger. Yeah. Their families would be in danger. And so we were teaming up with these local journalists, and some of them were somehow, I won't talk about how, getting us the footage. They talk to people who are affected, who are on the ground, and then somehow, using our own ways, we get that material and we report on these stories. So you don't actually see the face of the local journalist, but they are the ones who have done all the work. But then now we give them a platform so that that story is told. So I will be the face of that story, even though I'm not the person on the ground, because the person on the ground has done the most important work. But because no story is worth a life, then we have that teamwork. Because at the end of the day, it's really about the people who are affected by it. Yeah, so I just wanted to add that it's really complicated. It's hard to paint like a broad brush on all these issues. They're so difficult, and especially with access and everything. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree it's about teamwork, you know, but I mean, we've got to have a historical view of this, and it's undeniable that most of the times when you have crisis, you've got big reporters parachuting in. You know, take the 2011 Somali famine. You know, it's basically once famine was declared, everybody was waiting. They jump in, and then kind of the world moves then. But by the time famine is being declared, people are dying. People have been starving for a long time. And the fact is, there are reports that are produced often, regularly explaining. One of the problems is that the media is waiting for that one declaration, as if that is what sparks the hunger, you know, instead of covering the thing as it's going on. And I think in the case of, even Kenya in the Northeast, you've got the FuseNet reports that have been coming out regularly, you know, stating this is the problem, there's an issue here. And I think media has to start asking questions about what are the authorities doing with the reports that they're getting?
Yeah.
Why are they not preparing? Why are they not using them to prevent the hunger happening in the first place, rather than waiting for the declaration of famine? And this is where I have a problem with the shock value, that we are waiting for the big word famine, and then we respond. That we should be there before, so we can prevent famine happening in the first place.
If I may, I think, Patrick, you bring a very good point. I was actually in Peru 2 weeks ago, and we know in 3 months, catastrophic floods are going to happen because of El Nino. So we were working with local communities who are the true heroes, whose faces and names never come out. How do you actually prepare for it? We tried with many networks, but the first response was, when the flood hits, we might cover it. So it's very difficult to sell this. I also know, I can see Patricia sitting here with especially, even appointing someone to bring an extra spotlight. That's Reena Gilani with all new initiatives going on. I know that you all are struggling to get coverage on it. But by the way, this El Nino effect, but one point you mentioned, I think it's really, I would say very important, the point you made about there are other Western capitals where people are suffering. So I wonder whether the role of the media to really look at some of the fundamental human values, such as compassion and solidarity, is there anything more that could be done to make those connections between people? And I think it won't be fair to underestimate the contribution which ordinary people who often own less than $3 can contribute. Because number crunching and analysis in some of the Western countries where we work, what we found was 2020, when people lost jobs, they were on furloughs. But 3 things went up in this world from those ordinary people. The 3 acts of charity. They all were helping strangers more, the first one. The second, they were giving more time to a local charity. Doesn't matter whether. The third one, financially they were contributing more. So I think the ordinary people is a very important well, even if they put all their things together, it won't be a match for what UN can mobilize or the donors can mobilize. That is absolutely critical. So I was very encouraged by your point on what more could be done on the values and principles. Yeah.
Okay, David, and then we'll open up to
I
the
just
audience.
want to make a contribution about the critical role that community media plays in such situations. I'm not saying that a drought and these crises just have to happen in marginalized communities, but from the history of what has been happening, actually that is what happens. And I just want to know from you whether as humanitarian agencies, as UN, do you actually, get to know these community media personalities and outlets where maybe you can keep this narrative going? Because by the time maybe you approach an international media, like maybe, let's say, New York Times, they already maybe are engaged with our issues. But these are the people who actually are there, who know what has been actually happening. Me, actually, when I'm going to do a story from frontline communities, I usually mostly rely on these community media guys. They're the ones who point you and actually give you context, background context of what has been happening. If there are issues about policy follow-ups, whether county governments, in our case that is Kenya, has been doing anything to respond to these issues. So my point is actually this food crisis thing also needs the community media to be incorporated into it, because they're the ones actually who are in contact with what is happening on the ground.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Kevin, so much, because that was one of the points that I want to mention, and thank you for asking about it. I'll go very quickly. I think that's very important, collaboration between media and the humanitarian space. I think it's a win-win situation, because as you mentioned, the humanitarian NGOs will provide data, maybe access to experts, and maybe stories, and on the other hand, they will get visible and publicized, and maybe that's what we want, because we want to have more fund, or maybe to educate and raise awareness about a certain issue, or advocate for a certain issue, and that's what we need, right? And I think there are many things that we can we can work together on that, including maybe embedding journalists in field missions, for example. That could be one of the things, to see firsthand on the ground the programs and the affected people and what's going on. There are many areas for and opportunities for collaboration, I think, and I think that's really important. Sorry,
just before, just 1 second, I just want to throw a curveball to this as well. And I don't know if it's because I know there are a lot of storytellers in the room. The problem with Girls Agency, and I don't know if I could call it a problem, but when we give communities the opportunity to tell their stories, and as a journalist, you have this story that you want in your head. You're going into a community to talk about the food crisis, but you get into the community and, the community is talking about how resilient they are or just how life is going on as usual. Because, sometimes you can go into a community that has not eaten for days, which to you is a shock factor, but to them is almost like normal. So you go in there and you try to get the story from them, and they're giving you a different narrative. They're just talking about how I'm still going to school, we're still trying to see what to do. The mother is saying, I'm doing as much as I can. And you end up not getting the story that you'd want because you're giving the community agency. I just wonder how, when that happens, and maybe when we open it to the audience, they could talk to us about some of their own experiences when they go to the field, but that could also portend some challenges when it comes to telling the stories and allowing the communities to tell their stories, and then they don't tell the story that you want the world to hear so that they're able to help them.
Isn't that kind of the problem? Is you go in looking for your crisis story.
Yes.
People know when they're in crisis, and they'll tell you when they're in crisis, They also want to protect their dignity, which is something that you should respect, But you shouldn't go in saying, "Oh, I want to get a hunger story, and these people are not giving it to me," and stuff, So I would say let them tell you what they think the crisis is. The other thing I'll say that we should keep in mind is media operates at different levels, and a lot of what we are speaking about is sort of big international media that can appeal to big wealthy countries, Yeah. I think we need to look at what is national media doing, and sadly for a lot of them, they're waiting to take their cue from the bigger ones, rather than actually doing the reporting that would prevent the need for the big international agencies to come in. So we've got to say, working with all the way from community media to the national level, sub-national level, all the way to the mainstream press. To the international press. And it's creating a way, a new ethic, a new way of working that allows media to actually have an impact. Because in the end, I think even for media itself, they've got to ask, what is our job? What is it that we are there to do? What are we trying to achieve? And if all we are trying to achieve is eyeballs, then what's the difference with entertainment? Why don't we just put on cut videos, and stuff? We tell ourselves that we are making a difference, but are we really? And I think the way we work many times militates against us actually having the impact that we should. So we really need to rethink the entire way we've structured the press, how it works, and at what points we want interventions. One final thing. As I said before, most of the resources that people in crisis have are local, are diaspora, are their own governments, are neighborhood governments. They're not coming from far away, So when we privilege the reporting that says that, well, actually what we need is for the US to come in, we're ignoring all of this. So there's a lot that we are not mobilizing, and we are trying, we kind of teach helplessness, if you will, so governments sit and say, oh, we've got to wait for aid, etc. When actually, if we had put the pressure on them from before and they had acted, this wouldn't be necessary, at all. So I think for me, it's really, really important to keep in mind those structures of media and how we need to change how we work, and also who it is we are trying to mobilize, who it is that we are trying, we are speaking to.
Okay, so Unni, very quickly, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
Patrick, we had a genuine situation of a Category 5 cyclone impacting the western state of India, in Orissa, thanks to some fantastic mobilization early warning that worked like clockwork. We moved everyone in the community. I was actually on the ground. Everybody was moved to safe places. Of course, precious 100 lives lost. 2 stories, end of it. There was another, this was actually more than 5, bigger one. There was a smaller cyclone with no early warning, which resulted in more deaths. The story kept trending. The communities were saying, we got no attention and no resources coming in. But to answer your question, I'll do it in 30 seconds. We do connect with local reporters or local researchers, whatever they call themselves. For example, we did a report last year called Beyond Hunger. We put a simple question to the girls and communities. How is the hunger crisis impacting you now, and how are you coping with this? And we left the rest of the imagination to the ordinary people and the women and others, etc. But we'll be amazed to see what all were coming out and how they were coping, not just with the when they are hungry that night, but we know that girls were pulling out from schools quicker than boys. And when there is some little food to eat, the girls are eating last and sometimes they eat the least. So they were talking about how they deal with that rather than just the hunger. So I think the point you made about the multi-dimensions come out very clearly. It was good that we had a lot of debate whether we should go with 100 questions. We zeroed down to 2, and I actually think we got more from those 2 straightforward questions. Sorry, Evelyn.
Thanks, Unni. So, yeah, go ahead. We'll open, and then maybe we'll see if there are any questions online that we can also cater to. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Mbugwa. I'm a TV and film producer. And I have 2 questions, Umi and Basma. I'll start with about food security. There is the program by the county and national government for school feeding program. I would like to get your view on what you think about it and its sustainability to the families and to the children. And also, as much as we focus on covering these food security stories, what is the long-term goal? Because we can't keep covering Turkana for 50 years on the same issue. Yeah. What are the long-term? Yeah. What's the long-term picture like from UN and Plan International when it comes to having these long-term solutions for food security in African countries? Thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll just speak all the questions and then answer them. Okay.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lydia Wanjiku, and I work with an organization called Lensational. And what we do at Lensational is we equip women from marginalized areas with photography skills and tools so that they can tell their own stories around different issues. And the first thing, just to comment on what you asked about going into a community with a story, I think we quickly have learned from them that sometimes what we think needs to be told is not what they want to tell. And whenever we started gauging our impact, not based on the stories that we felt, oh my gosh, this is powerful, but if we flipped back the stories that were being told about these communities, if they felt represented, if they saw themselves in those stories. Most recently, we started working in climate change, so food security is right there, and connecting the women in these communities with policymakers by having policy workshops where they discuss those photographs and they say, this is what is happening in this photograph, this is why I took it. And government is really like, oh my God, I was touched. But I always wonder, like, how does that translate into planning and implementation? And perhaps maybe Plan and UN, you guys can answer that question. Like, how do such stories, or how can such stories turn into, move from just being really inspiring stories to stories that can inform decisions, that can inform policies and plans and programs? Yeah, thank you.
All right, there was one, okay, one there and one there.
Thank you for the 2 microphones. My name is Crispinas Juma. I am writing for Citizen Digital and as well as Radio Citizen. Good to see you. I know you've been there and many other familiar faces around. To the panelists, thank you for the great work, and to those who are part of where I'm seated, thank you for listening in. Gathara has mentioned something to do with whether we want to keep reporting about hunger, or which the UN will really have a problem with, whether we want to continue reporting about hunger in, for example, Turkana. Gathara, you will agree with me that either it's episodic or thematic reporting as far as crisis reporting is concerned. So we are looking at the Horn of Africa, for example. We are looking at millions of people having a problem with food. They don't have food. So how do you propose, from where you sit, you've been in the media for quite a while, and probably that equally goes to Anne Soy, I mean, from the perspective of the Western media, quote unquote, how best do we then tell these stories so that they have an impact, whether it is resource mobilization or action per se, or policy change? I remember, I think, early August, I went to Turkana to do a story about hunger. But on arriving to the ground, I realized that, look, there are 2 groups of women who are engaged in climate resilience programs. So I went with that story. And it was better than telling a story about 2 boys fighting for an animal hide in form of food. So you realize that for them, fighting over a hide of an animal is normal for them. But for a story like a woman being engaged in restoration of rangelands, it was more of a story that would have had more impact than the normal, glory images that we see on TV. So how best do we tell the stories of the Horn of Africa? Because we've had this tag of, the Western media has come in with their own kind of language of portraying Africa or portraying the Horn of Africa. We have languages that millions of people are devastated, millions of people are in hunger. I mean, are we really looking at millions of people in hunger, or is the situation just as okay as it may appear?
Okay.
Thank you.
So one question there and one here, and then we can...
Yeah, my name is Muhammad Al-Tayyib. I'm a Sudanese journalist. I work for Al Jazeera, Arabic channel, not English channel. By the way, I was in Sudan during the war, covering 2 months inside Khartoum capital. As you said, it's not easy to cover all that. But when we're talking about the food crisis, I think we cannot take it individual alone. It's linked with a lot of stuff. It's linked with the war. It's linked with the corruption. You cannot take it alone. But for my experience, I worked before with BBC and Sky News, and I'm traveling a lot. Dadaab here in Garissa, if you know Dadaab, and in Bangladesh as well, Rohingya crisis. But the problem is the NGOs that we work with us, they are not more cooperative with the journalists. That's what I feel. Even the WFP in Sudan, we have this same problem. UNICEF, we have same problem. They try to take, many of journalists to go with them to cover it. If you work with Reuters or AP or Al Jazeera or BBC, they come in to cover it. But they ignore the local news, and this is very important, what I believe. It's very important. If we want to cover the stories of the crisis, we need to support the local news. The local news that's affected. For example, now I work with a group in Sudan. They call it, we have a platform
we care only about the community. We don't care about the president, what happened, or any political issue. Even the war now is going on. We don't talking about what's happened in the war. We talking only about the community, how the community survive, how they deal with this. Because I tell the people who work with me, please forget about war, because during war we find hate speech. It's make the war coming worse than before. So don't talk about the war. Because in South Sudan we have dividing two. Someone is support RSF and the other one is support National Army. And they're fighting, even the social media, they're fighting all the time. So ignore this. Focus about what the people need. Assessment of the needs around the people. So this is very important if any NGO care about to support the local news and choose the good one. Because if you tell the story, I was in Uganda in February. We do a story about the soldier, child soldiers, when they have in the bush. We go the area, I'm sure even they don't have the internet, they cannot tell them story. They don't know. They have a problem, they don't have ID because they're coming from the bush and the community is not accept them, refuse them, and they need to have any ID. They need to tell whose father. They don't know. They kidnapped him when they was small. They don't know anything. So this is story, they cannot tell the story. They are very simple. I go to very Golo, and if you go Golo, go like 1 hour inside. They are still, far away from the community because the community did not accept them. So these stories, they need to deal with journalists. The journalists can reach these people, and sometimes they don't know. They don't know they are in crisis or not. So I don't like to talk too much, but anyway, this is my question.
Thank you. Thank you, Evelyn. I will try to be short. My name is Priscilla. I work for the UN Famine Prevention and Response Coordinator, Rina Gelani, and thank you very much for this panel. Well, I don't like that word, but it's really inspiring. Really, really, thank you. So maybe I'll start with the question, why do we need media attention at the UN? I mean, to be honest, we need it for the money. We need to mobilize resources. And we believe that by getting media attention, we'll get the resources we need to save lives that are in danger now. And numbers don't really speak, but it's over 250 million people now that are suffering from acute hunger. This is like massive, and in too many countries. So even if we don't have technically famine, as Patrick said, people are already dying. And so from a journalist's point of view, why would you tell the story, right? Because your job is to get stories that get likes and clicks, and unfortunately hunger doesn't, right? And impact also. So right now, because of social media, because of TikTok, what people care about is, 1, entertainment. They want to be entertained. 2 is like getting outraged. And we cannot get people entertained by hunger. We cannot get people outraged by hunger because we have changed also the way we tell stories. We don't want to put images of skinny children anymore on pictures because that would get outraged. We're not doing that anymore. And then inspiring stories. People want to get inspired. And if we talk about solutions, I think that's where we're trying to work with the media there. It's how can we get inspiring stories, not only for the Western audience that will bring the money we need, but also to local audience to inspire action, because as you said, humanitarian funding is just a fraction of the money which is needed on the ground to get things moving. We need to get the private sector, we need to get the local communities, the local governments to intervene as well. So that's where we really need the help of journalists here to get inspiring stories, because definitely we're not doing such a great job at that. But another point where we can do better or work together, it's also how we get the entertainment industry behind. How do we get people who have a voice that we don't have? Rina Gelani, she has 2,000 followers, and X, so she will not get very far. How do we get people who have a huge audience to make people care about that? I think there we can work together to make that shift so that it's an issue that people care about. And something that people can relate, I think it's the root causes of hunger. Because it touches every one of us. It's climate change and it's the cost of living crisis. And when we talk about those root causes, I think we can also get people attention. So maybe that's where we can get a bit of steer here. And again, thank you very much for that super interesting panel.
I know we could go on and on with this conversation, but I think we're the first panel to actually go over time. So I think we'll just do a quick round of final thoughts from the panel. A lot of the conversations are like on long-term solutions. Like, what do we need to do going forward? Do we need to channel our stories to a different audience, and how do we do that? Do we need to engage other players outside the mainstream media? And how do we go about that to ensure we get long-term solutions? I'll start with David here.
Oh, okay, thank you. For me, I think it's mostly about solution journalism. It's about, like we were talking about earlier, me as a journalist, I don't go to the field with a closed mind. Like you're saying, okay, you go there and then the narrative changes. And this is how perhaps you get to see stories that no one even has seen. Because you are going there to do a story on, this, terrible situation. By, like you say, he goes there and finds someone, actually a community which is, defying this by having sorghum plantations. And so that one, solution journalism is one of the way forward. I'm looking at this, how we can change this narrative. Then we should also look at an emerging trend where food is being weaponized. We saw Tigray, where, food was stolen and used to fuel conflicts around there. We've seen Somalia recently, where food was being used, I don't know, by clan people to put the people who are actually receiving aid, extract them from the, from what is rightful theirs, and also the geopolitics of food. This is something also that going forward, I think we need to take this conversation from the crisis to emerging trends that are actually being an offshoot of this crisis, and tell the story from there. If maybe solution journalism is not working, I would like to.
Yeah, Gathara, as you give your final, I know I've read a few of your articles on Al Jazeera, and a lot of them are also putting governments to account. What are you doing? Government is not accepting that the situation is the way it is. So maybe as you give your solutions, tell us what is the place also of putting governments and officials to to being accountable.
I think that's the answer to the question Rose sent to me, which was how do you cover this? If you go to Turkana and you've been covering it as hunger for decades and nothing is changing, how about you cover it as an accountability story? Who is failing? Why don't you talk about that? Then you might have some impact. So I think it's how we frame it. It's how we actually do our journalism. I don't think myself that people don't want to know how the world works. My experience both at the Elephant and the New Humanitarian has been that people are interested in understanding how their circumstances are. The problem is the media is very bad at doing that. It doesn't explain, it reports. It comes, it tells you this happened, why it happened, how long it's happened. These are things that are what they used to call day two journalism. It's not what we put on the front page. And I think that is a problem. It's how we do our journalism. And we need to have a revolution within the media itself so that we can actually tell better stories. And we gauge our impact, by whether or not our audience is well informed enough to actually solve its problems. if Turkana has continued to be the way it is for 50 years, and we've been reporting it, there's a problem with how we are reporting it.
Yeah.
And I think we need to look internally and to ask, how are we telling these stories? Who is telling them? Who are they telling them to? With what purpose? And I think a lot of times you're right, it is. We need get many clicks, we need get many page views. If those are our metrics, then we'll just keep sort of doing this superficial reporting. So it's really, really important that we think about the purpose and the impact we're trying to obtain, and then structure our reporting and our journalism to actually achieve that. The way it is now, I think we really need a revolution in global media ethics to actually change how we approach these things.
Thank you. Basma, 30 seconds, just quickly, what are your final thoughts on lasting solutions?
Okay, I think I'll try to cover very quickly the questions. On the long-term solution, I would say maybe focusing on, rather than life-saving programs, on development and livelihood opportunities offered by UN and INGOs, the humanitarian sector. I think this will allow more awareness of donors to support on these, and that would help people phase out, whether from hunger or conflict impact, etc. On pitching, I can continue later if you have any questions. On pitching stories to policymakers, I think first I would keep telling stories about that, and second, I would widen my network with journalists, maybe relevant community members, etc., and try to find a way to reach out to policymakers, etc., to help you put it out and maybe also make a change. Thank you.
Thank you. Anne.
Thank you very much. So I would like us to leave this session with the acknowledgement that we all need each other. And I know there are people who have problems with foreign journalists coming into a country, telling the story and then disappearing. Community media is very important, but they may not have the platform to ask questions to global policymakers. So we all need each other. Serving the different audiences that we serve, we need to work together, and sometimes the way a foreign media house will cover a story will be slightly different from how the community media covers it, because your audiences are already so, they know the story in a different way. But I'm explaining to somebody who doesn't care, I like to think about somebody in New Zealand, not that they don't care about story, because it's so far away from where I live in New Zealand. What would make them care? And how do I tell this story in a way that will make them care? And then, so I see the role of global media as amplifying the important work that has already been done over and over again by community media, by national media, and taking it to a global level. And that's where the data comes in. Somebody asked, why do we talk about millions affected? The scale is very important when you're telling these stories, because if you want policymakers to care, you have to give them a sense of scale. And that's why the reports that you do in your organizations are very important for us. So we'll use those reports, but we will go to the ground to look for the very personal stories and combine all that. And, just talk about the context, analysis. And if you're talking about climate change, it's such a complex thing, bringing in experts to explain that. So that's the whole journalism that we need to do, and we all need each other, and we absolutely need these inspiring stories of people who are doing something positive in their communities, bringing change. But let's be careful not to sugarcoat crisis, because we need people to care. And so if they see that, a woman is doing something wonderful in her community, oh, that's wonderful, let me go ahead with, everything else that I need to do. But they also see the suffering, the need that is there, then they get to care, and, they get to ask these questions to the policymakers. I think we need a mix of both.
Yeah.
I could give examples, but we don't have time. So basically, let's keep doing this. Let's not give up on Turkana because we've been doing it. And I absolutely feel you. having been in the industry for close to 2 decades, I'm like, but I was there 10 years ago and then 5 years ago and nothing has changed.
Yeah.
Let's not give up, because those people who are affected by these crises, they need us. They need us to keep telling the story in the different platforms that we have. My brother here was talking about, them avoiding the politics and just talking about the welfare. It's a very important thing. But we need somebody who will also talk about the politics. So if you have somebody who's removed from that crisis, who's coming from, the outside looking in, then they have to speak truth to power, to ask questions to the generals and, to put them to account. So that's why I say my message today is we all need each other. Let's keep doing our jobs.
Oni, your final thoughts as you also speak to the local journalists working with NGOs.
Yeah, 3 quick comments. I'll try to do it in less than 1 minute. So first point is about the point you raised. It's about being local, both globally connected but locally relevant. What I saw in Afghanistan was ordinary people were interested to know where the immunization will take place next week. They were least bothered about what was happening in Geneva, the negotiations between Taliban and others. So in the same way, right now a big movement in the south of India is narrowcast, not broadcast, because FM they don't allow them to do in a massive broadcast about how the clouds are changing and what fisher folk need to be concerned about in the next 24 hours. So very narrow, about 10 kilometers range, so getting it out. So this is one thing. The second, there was a question about, is it not boring when you keep reporting? Well, I'm not sure, because I looked at the last edition of the New York Times yesterday, and also almost every newspaper, they continue to report something without any change for the last 50 years. This is a page where you can see how the stocks are changing. Every day, boring numbers. And I did call up some of the editors and asked, this is boring, nothing has changed in 50 years. Why do you keep printing? They told me there is an audience for that. That's a small number. So I believe there is an audience for everything. That comes to my last point. If you keep reporting, will it solve a problem? The point you made. We don't know until we try. Do we have an option? We are talking about human lives. We have to keep trying. We will fail at once. We might modify ourselves. And your question, the specific question, sustainable solutions, aid is never a substitute for political action. If anyone is dreaming about it, we are on the wrong planet. So that's one thing. Even more profound today with the hunger crisis. But what we know for sure is that clearly, if you look at that, hunger, what we have been discussing, is a solvable problem. It is possible to solve it. For someone who is rich, it's about dialing the Uber Eats for the delivery or clicking the next supermarket to deliver something. But that's not the case with most of the people we confront with. And you had a very specific question about school feeding. Well, education and food are fundamental rights. And protecting rights is a fundamental responsibility of governments. So why are we afraid to talk about scaling up hunger response and education program? And especially your point on school feeding, my very last comment. School feeding, we have seen it. It's not just about, it's a single important intervention that helps to get more children to schools. Of course, great teachers help, fantastic schools work, but if these two are there in a hunger zone, nothing works. So I would strongly make, when it comes to hunger, finding food, sustainable solutions, but most importantly also dealing with the immediate needs. It's the rights of the affected people, and the governments worldwide have a responsibility to protect it.
Thank you so much. Just as I wind up, just to support something that Anne says, based on our own experience in the NGO space, when we are dealing with situations in country, it's difficult, even for our own country office, to talk about the issue. Something like in Ethiopia with Tigray, our office does not want to be seen like it's siding, for or against the government. So they'd rather not speak to the issue. So that's where now regional offices and global offices come in to amplify that conversation outside of the country to other people who will listen and may help. So just to amplify what Anne was saying, that we work together, just the fact that maybe community people or the people in country are not speaking as, emphatically about something, that doesn't mean that other people cannot come in and step in, but still help them amplify and talk about their issues outside that space, if it's critical or if it's dangerous for them to speak about it. The second thing as we wrap up is to talk about something that was mentioned here in passing, the importance of us to talk beyond hunger. So we may be talking about stories of hunger, but what are the secondary impacts of hunger? Those are also stories that could help fuel or flesh the story of hunger. Girls are now not going to school because of that. FGM is on the increase because girls are being given away for marriage. So such issues that help to contextualize and talk about the secondary impact are also important to be able to fuel the hunger conversation. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. This was such an amazing conversation that could go on. And for our online audience, thank you for joining us. Guys, we can break for tea? Yeah? Thanks. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.